So when does Lacan himself speak about phenomenology? I want to give us a short example of that, and then also give another little example of a kind of robust critique of a certain phenomenological approach within psychiatry that Lacan offers. So we're thinking about beyond the reality principle, and interestingly, beyond the reality principle, and of course I'm using the 2006 edition, the Bruce Fink translation of Lacan's Decree, we have a section, interestingly entitled, A Phenomenological Description of Psychoanalytic Experience. So there it is, a phenomenological description of psychoanalytic experience. And I'll just pick out a few lines which hopefully will give us a flavor of what Lacan is going to do here. He says on page 66, second paragraph on the page, the pre-given of this experience, that is, the psychoanalytic experience, is first some language. A language, in other words, a sign. How complex is the problem of what it signifies? Okay, so we have the prioritization of language, a sign. He notes a few lines down, the psychoanalyst, in order not to detach analytic experience from the language of that situation that it implies, comes upon the simple fact that language, prior to signifying something, signifies to someone. And then on the next page, he will say, in analytic experience, attention thus turns out to be unconscious insofar as it is expressed and conscious insofar as it is repressed. And language, being approached by its function of social expression, reveals both its significant unity in intention and its constitutive ambiguity as subjective expression. Oh my God. Lots of things we could say about that, but here it seems that two important moves, as already anticipated, language must be itself accorded not an epiphenomenal role, but a very fundamental, foundational role in what we're thinking about in terms of a psychoanalytic engagement, as must the intersubjective nature of that relationship. And those concepts start to come before any sense of immediate experience. Right, so we have that. Let's do another little reference point. This is back to Seminar 3, so we're thinking about 1955. Back to Seminar 3, and there's a really evocative moment right towards the beginning of the seminar where Lacan is setting out on this task of foregrounding the originality, the innovativeness of how he wants to approach psychosis and the methods he wants to go on to utilize in doing so. So on page 6, he says, middle of the page, the major progress in psychiatry since the introduction of this movement of investigation called psychoanalysis has consisted, or so it's believed, in restoring meaning to the chain of phenomena. So he wants to foreground the role of psychoanalysis in thinking psychiatric problems and thinking psychosis in particular, but he's now having a kind of quizzical moment. Is it always about the understanding of meaning? This is something that he's opening up a real question, a real critique about. What we're supposed to have learned, once again, is that we must understand patients. Sounds reasonable? Lacan answers, this is a pure mirage. The notion of understanding has a very clear meaning. It's a source that, under the name of relation of understanding, Karl Jaspers has made the pivot of all so-called general psychopathology. It consists in thinking that some things are self-evident. That, for example, when someone is sad, it's because he doesn't have what his heart desires. Nothing could be more false. There are people who have all that their heart desires and are still sad. So there's quite a lot going on there. And it did make me want to go and see if this characterization of Jaspers and Jaspers's approach to psychiatry, and more specifically Jaspers's approach to psychopathology in the psychiatric domain, really does pivot on this idea of understanding of others. And I think it's fair to say that that is in fact true. Lacan wants to do the counterintuitive thing of saying understanding is often symptomatic of a broader problem. Of course, that opens up the question of what do we do instead of understanding? But for the time being, his suggestion would be, and bear in mind that Jaspers is a phenomenological psychiatry, and you can understand here how both the notion of intersubjectivity and the wish to understand the other through me, through my own experience, which Jaspers does say, okay? The attempt to understand the other through my own reference of experience, that's not something that Lacan is going to be happy with. He gives a couple of examples, but we could add some of our own. For example, a subject, and this is one of Jaspers's examples that we will do some critical work on. Jaspers says, well, if someone is attacked, they will be angry. But you don't need to take too many steps into the Freudian universe to know that for some people to be attacked, maybe not all people, might come as a relief. In other words, it's a good clinical principle not to assume that you do know what one's effective response to a given situation is. Another example that Jaspers gives is the idea of the partner, the person whose partner has betrayed them with someone else. And he's like, well, they will be, upset, whatever. But of course, in Freudian terms, you could say, well, there may be another whole series of reactions that they may have to that, including one of curiosity or erotic stimulation. So I grant that this is very Freudian, these kinds of counterintuitive questions, but one would have to say that clinically it's worthwhile not presuming to know. So we'll draw a little line under that, but this is just one moment when a nice, I think, episode where we see that Lacan wants to take issue with a certain phenomenological precept, certainly as it's applied in psychiatry by Karl Jaspers. Okay, so now we're going to take a little bit of a deep dive, and we're going to look at what I think is quite a remarkable text. And I'm going to be referring to this book, Reading Seminars 1 and 2, Lacan's Return to Freud. And I get a certain perverse delight out of this, because what we have here is something which might be contrary to how many Lacanians would approach the topic of Lacan and phenomenology. Many Lacanians thinking about Lacan and phenomenology would say the book is closed and it's not a very long book. No more engagement. But the one person who really can explore that in quite a lot of detail, and Lacanians are kind of forced to listen to, is Jaques-Alain Miller. Okay. So Jaques-Alain Miller has a number of interesting things to say, and he will push forward an argument which highlights some of the indebtedness that Lacan has to phenomenology. So we're starting on page 9. He's saying, what is happening with Lacan in 1953? And he says, well, in 1953, things are going on. He says the theoretical moment is best characterized by the fact that Lacan managed to locate a point of convergence between phenomenology and structuralism. We should remember Lacan was a psychiatrist, not a philosopher or an academic, and he was phenomenologically oriented. By phenomenology, I mean Husserlian phenomenology, for it was Husserl's version which was incorporated into psychiatry by Karl Jaspers. So we've set up a really nice contradiction of sorts. On the one hand, we have a very strident critique of Jaspers, and then we have a sense, I forget whether Miller actually mentions it here, but at the time of Lacan's doctoral dissertation, Jaspers was a big deal. Yeah, in some respects, you could say that that dissertation was Jasperian or Jasperian in its orientation. I believe that Lacan may be deemed an existentialist up until 1953. And we'll just give this quote, and then we'll end this section of these mini lectures. 1953 was not the year that Lacan abandoned existentialism and phenomenology for structuralism. It was rather the year that he blended the two. Function and field is a blending of the two. Lacan's theory of speech at that time is still, in a sense, existential and phenomenological, while his theory of language is structuralist. So you could say then that, and this is significant because function and field is supposed to be the big arrival of Lacan's formal teaching. And if he's still indebted to phenomenology there, that seems significant.